The ballroom lights hit the crystal like rain on glass. And when the door swung wide, my husband walked in as if he owned the night, a young woman on his arm, and my grandmother's diamond pendant winking at her throat. People stopped mid-toast. The band missed a beat, and the room seemed to tilt as phone screens lifted one by one. I felt the weight of every promise he'd ever made settle in my chest, cold and heavy, while the pendant threw small mocking stars across the marble floor. She touched the stone like it belonged to her, smiled toward me, and leaned closer to whisper something in his ear that made him laugh. Somewhere behind me, a glass cracked softly as it met the edge of a table, and the sound traveled through the hush like a warning. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The necklace did the talking, and every eye in the room understood the language.
Before I tell you how we ended up at that doorway, with my heirloom on a stranger, and our life split clean down the middle, tell me where you're listening from tonight and tap like and subscribe if stories of truth, justice, and second chances keep you company. My name is Melissa, and if you had met me a year ago, you would have said I was lucky. I married a man who looked like reliability in a pressed shirt. We bought a tidy 2-story in a quiet Des Moines neighborhood, and we raised our daughter with the kind of routines that feel like lullabies, school drop-offs. Sunday pancakes, the first chilly night when we brought the sweaters down from the attic. I grew up in a family that believed steadiness could fix almost anything. My mother kept lists for her lists, and my father said a promise was a bridge you didn't burn even when the river ran low. When my grandmother passed, she left me a modest inheritance and that diamond pendant, and I told Drew we'd use the money as our foundation while I paused my Chicago job offer and made our home the project that mattered most. Drew had a gift for making introductions at open houses, charity mixers, ribbon cuttings, where he shook hands like each new face was a door opening to another bright hallway. He said whenever his business came up, told people I was the reason the wheels kept turning, and kissed my cheek in front of clients in a way that made them smile at us like we were a brand. I told myself the late nights were just the cost of ambition, that the scent of cologne I didn't own was from some crowded elevator, that his phone face down on the counter was a habit, not a secret. When Grace came along, I folded my degree into the top dresser drawer and learned the rhythm of thermometers and field trip forms, certain that someday I'd unfold my career again without a crease. On weekends, we'd drive past houses Drew said he'd rehab soon, and he'd point with the easy confidence of a man who saw the future and had already shaken its hand. My grandmother's pendant lived in our safe, or so I believed, wrapped in a square of soft flannel that still faintly smelled of her rose water. On the days when the house felt too quiet, I'd hold the key and think about the women in my family who had done what needed doing without applause. The money she left helped us put down our first down payment and grease the rough edges when Drew's deals ran long, and he promised almost shyly that one day it would all circle back to me with interest. I built a memory palace out of those promises room by room, believing that patience and kindness could mortar any crack. If there were shadows in the corners, I swept around them and kept the floors shining. We were to anyone watching from the sidewalk, a family with good posture. I had coffee with Naomi after her shifts, and she'd tease me that I fussed over seasonal wreaths like they were the last word in security. Grace learned to tie a scarf the way my grandmother taught me, and she'd stand on her tiptoes to loop the ends just right before school. Every so often, Drew would come home, electric with good news. A deal closed, a client charmed, and he'd lift Grace off the kitchen floor and spin her once, twice, like a man who knew exactly what mattered. I'd watch them and think that maybe steadiness was a choice you made every day until it became a truth. In that season, if the wind shifted, I told myself it was just autumn arriving early. The night of the party, I stepped into a dress the color of good navy ink and clipped on simple studs because my pendant was too dear for a crowd. The caterer's staff moved like a flock of small birds, purposeful and quiet, and the band slipped from Motown to something softer that let people talk. I checked my phone, checked the door, checked the time, and told Naomi not to worry. He runs late when he cares most. When the ballroom doors finally opened and I saw the pendant gleam against another woman's skin, something old and faithful in me sat down and refused to rise. I realized all at once that steadiness without honesty is just a performance. The night of the party should have ended with laughter candles and photographs that found their way into family albums. Instead, I walked away with my grandmother's necklace clutched in my palm, the sting of betrayal sharper than any jewel could ever be. For days afterward, the image of Kayla's manicured hand stroking that pendant replayed in my mind, and each time it struck me harder than the last. I told myself that perhaps it was a nightmare, but the whispers that followed me through the grocery store, the sympathetic looks from neighbors, and the absence of Drew's explanations told me otherwise. He came home late, eyes bloodshot, tie loose, carrying the weight of shame he refused to name. The first sign that I wasn't simply being suspicious came from Grace. It was a Saturday morning, quiet and bright, when she sat at the kitchen table scrolling her phone while her cereal went soggy. I was rinsing dishes when she looked up and said softly, almost carelessly, "Mom, I saw Dad at the mall yesterday." My hands stilled water dripping from the sponge onto the floor. She shifted in her seat, her eyes sliding back to the screen as though saying it aloud might make the truth less sharp. "He wasn't alone," she added. My voice faltered when I asked what she meant, but she didn't notice. She was too intent on finishing her story. Grace told me she had seen her father walking beside a woman with long red nails, the two of them laughing as if no one else in the world existed. They held hands openly, not as if they had something to hide, but as though they were proud to be seen. My daughter hesitated before describing the necklace, my necklace resting against the stranger's collarbone. The air left my lungs in a rush, and I turned away quickly so she wouldn't see the color drain from my face. I thanked her, kissed her head, and excused myself to the bathroom. Behind the locked door, I slid to the floor, my body trembling against the cold tiles. Tears came hot and fast, not only from pain, but from the clarity that rushed in with them. For years, I had second-guessed myself, folded my instincts into small boxes, and tucked them away where they couldn't embarrass me. Drew had been quick with explanations, his voice firm, his gaze steady, always leaving me wondering if I had imagined the scent of unfamiliar perfume or the missed calls at odd hours. But Grace's voice held no agenda, no motive. She had spoken with the plain truth of a child, and in that truth, there was no room left for denial. That afternoon, I carried laundry up the stairs as though nothing had changed, but inside, everything had. I looked at the family photographs, lining the hallway, smiling faces at Christmas, a summer picnic. Grace's first day of middle school, and I realized how much of my life had been staged for the sake of appearances. I had convinced myself that keeping the house polished and the schedule full was a kind of loyalty, that endurance was a measure of love. But standing there, listening to the dryer hum, I knew loyalty had been a one-way street, and I had been walking it alone for years. The necklace became a symbol, not just of my grandmother's love, but of what I had sacrificed. She had left me money for security, for choices I might one day need to make. I had handed it all to Drew without hesitation, believing we were partners, believing his word was as good as a contract. Now I saw the truth. Those funds had built not only his company, but the foundation for his betrayal. Every polished shoe, every dinner out, every late-night meeting had been financed by the inheritance meant to safeguard me and Grace. I tried in those first days after the party to measure my response. I told myself to wait, to breathe, to give him a chance to explain. But explanations never came. He acted as though nothing had happened, moving through the house, with the same patterns: pouring coffee, answering calls, flipping through the mail. Only now each gesture carried a weight of arrogance that I couldn't ignore. When I met his eyes across the kitchen table, I didn't see regret. I saw calculation. One evening, as he packed an overnight bag for yet another business trip, I caught the faintest whiff of Kayla's perfume clinging to his jacket. It was not a scent that belonged to me, and it hung in the air like evidence. He smiled thinly and said he'd be back in 2 days. My lips parted, but no words came. I let him walk out, knowing I had finally stopped asking questions I already knew the answers to. At night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the silence of the house pressing against me. Grace slept down the hall, and I kept still so she wouldn't hear the restless shifting of sheets. I thought of my grandmother, of her hands guiding mine, as she fastened the necklace on me for the first time. She told me it was a reminder that strength sometimes hides in small, quiet places. I realized then that I could no longer live in pretense. The truth was out, and pretending only deepened the wound. The shift in me was subtle at first, a quiet hardening in the spaces where softness had lived too long. I noticed Drew's habits with sharper eyes, the way he guarded his phone, the new shirts he bought without asking, the restlessness in his voice when he thought I wasn't listening. Where once I would have smoothed over the cracks, now I let them widen, observing without rushing to fill the silence. Each moment added to a growing certainty this marriage was broken beyond repair, and it was not by accident. The night came when I stood alone in the kitchen, the necklace resting on the counter in front of me, its diamonds catching the dim light. I pressed my palms against the cool stone and whispered to myself that I had been more than faithful, more than patient, and still he had chosen betrayal. The ache in my chest was heavy, but underneath it lived something sharper, a resolve I had never allowed to surface. Betrayal had been the end of the story I thought I was writing, but it was also the beginning of a new one. By the time Drew returned from his so-called trip, I had stopped waiting for apologies. I had stopped waiting for explanations. He walked through this door, humming under his breath, tossing his keys onto the counter, and for the first time I looked at him not as my husband, but as the architect of his own downfall. I spoke little, but my silence had a strength he wasn't prepared for. When he kissed my cheek, I turned my head away, and the look on his face told me he had noticed the change. The cracks were no longer invisible, no longer mine to hide. The truth had slipped into the open through Grace's simple honesty, and once spoken, it couldn't be buried again. In the quiet, after he went upstairs, I touched the necklace one last time and made myself a promise. I would not be the one to crumble. I would not be the one to hide. From this moment forward, every step I took would be measured and deliberate, because the storm I had once feared was no longer approaching, it was already here. And deep inside, I knew that when it broke, I would be the one left standing. The days that followed Grace's confession blurred together, but the ache beneath my ribs sharpened with each hour. I kept my movements steady, so my daughter wouldn't see how rattled I was, but the stillness inside me was heavy. I folded laundry, stirred dinner, and made polite conversation as though nothing had changed, but every word felt rehearsed. The moment she told me about the necklace, the denial I had clung to for years slipped away, and in its place came an emptiness that was harder to carry. At night, when the house was quiet, I lay awake listening to the rhythm of Drew's snores from across the room. There was a time when that sound meant safety proof that we were under the same roof building something together. Now it struck me as mockery, the easy breathing of a man who thought deception was just another deal to manage. I stared at the ceiling, my body tense while the minutes dragged toward dawn. The silence between us wasn't peaceful anymore. It was suffocating. I tried not to let Grace notice, but she was perceptive. One evening, as she set the table, she asked softly, "Mom, are you okay?" I forced a smile,
told her I was just tired, and kissed her forehead before turning back to the oven. She accepted the answer, but her eyes lingered, studying me longer than usual. I realized then that my daughter had seen more of the truth than I wanted her to, and pretending wouldn't protect her anymore. When Drew breezed in late that night, his tie loosened his cologne unfamiliar, he gave me a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Long day," he muttered, tossing his keys on the counter. I nodded, keeping my voice level, though the words stuck in my throat. The silence that stretched between us carried more weight than any argument. He scrolled his phone while I washed dishes, and in that space, I understood what it meant to live as strangers. The grief came in waves. In the bathroom, steam fogging the mirror, I pressed my palms against the sink and tried to steady my breathing. I whispered apologies to myself for not listening sooner, for shrinking to make room for his ambitions, for calling sacrifice devotion when it was really surrender. The tears came hot and relentless. Yet beneath them pulsed a simmering anger I had never allowed myself to feel. It was sharper than sorrow, and it refused to be ignored. I remembered the early years, how he had convinced me to turn down my Chicago job, to follow him, how he promised my grandmother's inheritance was our investment, even though every paper bore only his signature. I thought back to the times he praised me in front of others as the reason he could succeed, while at home I was the one patching the leaks he left behind. Those memories no longer looked like devotion. They looked like stepping stones he had used to climb higher while I sank deeper. My body carried the exhaustion of years spent holding everything together, but my mind finally saw the pattern clearly. I thought about how he twisted my instincts into accusations, how he dismissed my questions with practiced ease, and how quickly he could turn my loyalty into leverage. I had mistaken his composure for love and my silence for strength. But strength doesn't mean disappearing into someone else's shadow. That realization lodged itself deep inside me, and though it hurt, it also anchored me. One Sunday morning, as sunlight poured through the kitchen window, I poured coffee and realized the taste felt different. Bitter, not because of the brew, but because of the company. Drew came in, humming, poured himself a mug, and didn't notice how my hand trembled as I set the sugar jar down. He kissed the top of my head absently, the gesture automatic, and I stayed still, feeling nothing. In that moment, I knew what had shifted. I wasn't his partner anymore. I was his witness. I stopped trying to reach for explanations. I stopped smoothing the rough edges of his lies. When Naomi called to ask how the party had gone, I hesitated, then told her only that it hadn't ended well. She pressed gently, but I couldn't bring myself to say the words yet. Speaking them aloud felt like opening a wound too wide to close. Instead, I listened to her stories from the hospital, the weight of her voice reminding me what honesty sounded like. That night, I found myself in front of the safe where the necklace should have been. The key turned easily, but when I lifted the lid and saw the empty flannel square, my throat tightened. The space where it once lay was hollow, cold, and final. I pressed my fingers against it, remembering how my grandmother's hands had been steady when she passed it to me. She had said it wasn't just jewelry, it was a promise that our family sacrifices would not be forgotten. Drew had stolen more than a stone. He had stolen that promise. Sitting there in the dim light of the closet, I finally admitted it to myself. My marriage wasn't broken by accident. It was dismantled piece by piece by a man who knew exactly what he was doing, and no amount of patience or loyalty could build it back again. The tears that came then were different, not frantic, but steady, like a river, carving its path. They carried sorrow, yes, but they also carried resolve. Grace knocked on the door a little while later, asking if I wanted tea. I swallowed hard,
wiped my face, and told her I'd be right out. She didn't press, just left a mug on the table for me, steam curling into the air. That small kindness steadied me more than she could have known. I carried the cup to the sofa and sat there long after she went to bed, the warmth seeping into my hands as I stared at the darkened windows. By the time Drew returned from another late night out, I had dried my eyes. He glanced at the empty cup and asked if I'd been waiting up. I shook my head, told him no, and went upstairs without another word. His voice followed me, half confused, half irritated, but I didn't stop. I had no more energy to explain myself to a man who had already chosen someone else. The silence between us grew heavier with each day, but inside that silence, something else began to take root. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was the recognition that I couldn't stay buried in grief forever. I could mourn what I had lost, but I would not stay there. My grandmother's necklace might have been tarnished by betrayal, but her memory carried me toward something sharper. I began to see the outline of a new path, faint, but undeniable. I wasn't ready to walk it yet, but I could feel the ground shifting beneath me. My heartbreak was no longer only pain. It was becoming clarity, and clarity carried its own kind of strength. The morning after I admitted to myself that my marriage was truly over, I felt different. My eyes were swollen from tears, my mouth dry from a night of restless tossing. But inside, I carried a sharpness I had never felt before. The grief that had wrapped itself around my shoulders was still there, yet it had loosened its grip. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the necklace on the nightstand, its surface catching the light in small, stubborn flashes, and realized I couldn't spend another day waiting for apologies that would never come. I moved through the house quietly, pouring coffee into my favorite mug and sitting at the kitchen table with a pen and pad of paper. My hand trembled at first, but the more I wrote, the steadier I became. I listed every account I could remember: joint checking, savings, the brokerage Drew had opened in both our names, the credit cards we used for household expenses. Years of mental notes, sticky reminders, and old emails came back to me as I pieced together logins and passwords. For so long I had left the numbers to him, trusting his word. But that morning, I reminded myself that half of it was mine. By noon, I was sitting at my laptop, determination replacing fear. I reset passwords, froze accounts, and transferred what I could into holdings that bore only my name. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about safety, about making sure Grace and I wouldn't be left with nothing if Drew decided to drain us dry. With each completed transfer, I felt my shoulders lift a little higher. He had underestimated me for years, and that was his mistake. That afternoon, I searched for a lawyer. My fingers hesitated on the keyboard at first, as though typing divorce attorney Des Moines might make the decision too real. But then I pressed enter. One name rose to the top of every list: Diane Patel. Review after review called her sharp, relentless, and unshakable in court. I dialed the number before I could second-guess myself, and when her assistant answered, I scheduled a consultation for Monday morning. Hanging up the phone, I exhaled long and steady. The first brick of my new foundation was laid. The rest of the weekend became a careful inventory. I walked through each room of the house as though I were a soldier mapping out a battlefield. Jewelry, documents, photographs, and heirlooms went into a locked trunk. I packed bags for Grace and myself, enough to last if we needed to leave quickly, tucking them away in the back of the closet. I carried boxes from the basement, items Drew hadn't touched in years, and placed them where I could reach them if a judge later asked for proof of ownership. Each step was quiet, deliberate, and hidden beneath the ordinary hum of family life. The most difficult part came late at night when Drew was away. His laptop sat on the kitchen counter, the lid slightly ajar, and I felt the weight of temptation press against me. For years, I had respected his privacy, telling myself that trust meant turning away. But trust had already been broken, and now it was evidence I needed. My hands moved carefully over the trackpad as I searched. The arrogance that had fueled his double life left him sloppy emails, unsorted photos, unencrypted receipts, tucked away in forgotten folders, hotel confirmations, dinner reservations under false names, photographs of Kayla with my necklace glinting under restaurant lights. I saved everything. Screenshots filled a hidden folder, then transferred to a flash drive and backed up to the cloud. Each file was like a stone placed in a wall, undeniable proof that what I had endured wasn't paranoia, but betrayal. When I finally closed the laptop, the kitchen looked different. It was no longer just the place where I scrubbed away his messes at midnight. It had become my command center, and I felt taller standing there. The first ripple of consequence came faster than I expected. On Monday morning, Drew tried to use a company card at his favorite coffee shop. By noon, word reached me from one of his colleagues who had been standing in line behind him. Card declined, twice the message read, followed by 3 clapping emojis. I stared at the screen, a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. Later that day, my phone buzzed with texts from Drew. "Did you forget to pay the Amex? It just got declined at lunch." 10 minutes later, another Susan, my debit card too. "Is the bank having issues?" I didn't answer either message. When he stormed through the front door that evening, his face red and his tie pulled loose, he slammed his briefcase onto the counter and demanded, "What the hell did you do?" I kept my voice calm. I protected myself. His jaw clenched, stunned that I didn't even attempt denial. "Protected yourself. Those are our accounts. I had a business lunch today, Susan. Do you know how it looked when my card got declined?" I set my mug down slowly and met his gaze. "Imagine how I looked last week when another woman walked into my birthday party wearing my grandmother's necklace. Imagine how it felt to see you parade her like a prize. If you think I'm going to keep funding that circus, you're out of your mind." For once, he didn't have a slick answer. He muttered something about Grace trying to change the subject, but I told him she was staying with my mother until the house felt safe again. His anger cracked into desperation. "You're overreacting. We can fix this." I laughed quietly, not out of humor, but disbelief. "Fix this? You humiliated me in front of everyone we know. You don't come back from that." The color drained from his face. He realized then that I wasn't bluffing, that the woman who had once bent over backward to keep peace was gone. I pulled the trunk of valuables closer to the door, a gesture more final than any words. "This is just the beginning, Drew. You started this war, but I'll be the one who finishes it." That night, I locked the bedroom door with him on the other side and felt something shift in me. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was power. For years, I had lived in fear of what leaving might cost me. Now, for the first time, I saw what staying had already taken. The next few days showed me how quickly reputation can fray. At the office, colleagues whispered about his coffee shop embarrassment. In our social circle, half the friends who had once smiled at his jokes now stayed silent, unwilling to take sides but clearly watching. Naomi called, her voice filled with quiet steel, saying, "You're doing the right thing, Mel. Don't back down." My parents offered the same support. My mother wept when I told her the truth, my father muttering under his breath, "If I ever see him again, he'll regret it." Their loyalty steadied me more than they knew. Grace, too, saw the shift. When I tucked her into bed one night, she hugged me tight and whispered, "I'm glad you're not pretending anymore."
Her words nearly undid me. Pretending had been my survival, but it had also cost her the illusion of stability. At least now, she had the truth. Drew spiraled quickly. Angry voicemails, pleading texts, sudden appearances at the front door where he banged loud enough to draw the neighbors' attention. One night, I opened the door just enough to show him my face. "You should leave," I told him calmly. His hair was disheveled, his voice ragged, his pride bleeding out on the porch for everyone to see. He accused me of ruining his reputation, of jeopardizing his business, of being manipulated. But I saw the truth in his eyes. He still thought it was about saving face. He couldn't understand that it was about me, about the years I had given up, and the inheritance I had trusted him with. I smiled slowly, deliberately. "I know exactly what I'm doing." His fists clenched, but he didn't cross the threshold. Not anymore. When he finally stormed off, tires spitting gravel in the driveway, I stood in the doorway and felt no regret. The man who once polished his image until it shone now looked like a shadow of himself. And for the first time in years, I wasn't the one left powerless. By Saturday night, the storm I had unleashed was already taking form. I walked into a restaurant Drew and I had once frequented, the kind of place where waiters remembered our favorite wine and clients came to shake his hand. I hadn't expected to see him there, but when I spotted his back stiff at a corner booth and Kayla seated across from him, I didn't turn away. She fiddled with her napkin nervously while whispers trailed from table to table. His eyes darted when he noticed me, and for the first time in years, I saw fear flicker across his face. I crossed the polished floor without hesitation, my heels striking a rhythm that drew the room's attention. Conversation stalled forks hovered, and every gaze followed me. I stopped at their table and spoke evenly, my voice carrying. "So this is where my grandmother's money has gone. Steaks and wine for the girl who wore her necklace to my birthday party." Gasps rippled through the restaurant, the sound sharper than any violin. Kayla flushed, gripping her purse strap with trembling hands. Drew leaned forward, muttering my name, but I cut him off. "It's not just the affair," I continued, calm, but deliberate. "It's the arrogance. You thought I would be too weak, too loyal, too blind to fight back. But every meal, every purchase, every trip, it was paid for with my sacrifice." Laughter erupted at one table, disbelief at another. Phones lifted into the air, recording the moment. Kayla rose abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and hurried out. That left Drew alone, pale and shrinking under the weight of eyes that had once admired him. He mumbled something about harassment, but no one believed it. I leaned closer and delivered what I knew would linger. "You didn't just cheat on me. You stole from me. Every dollar, every hour, every promise. And now the truth is yours to live with." When the waiter returned to his table, Drew reached for his wallet, only to hear the same words I had already anticipated. "Sir, your card has been declined." Silence swept across the room. Then whispers built again. I turned on my heel, head high, and walked out with the certainty that the story would spread before sunrise. By morning, it had. Screenshots, shaky videos, and hashtags carried my words across social media. Friends who had stayed silent after the birthday party now reached out, some with sympathy, some with awe. Local blogs picked it up, describing it as the downfall of a man who once strutted through Des Moines with unshakable charm. Drew scrambled to contain the fire. On Monday, he recorded a video in his office trophies behind him, his voice lowered in a poor attempt at contrition. He called Kayla a colleague, insisted the receipts were taken out of context, and begged for privacy. Watching from my living room, I almost laughed at the audacity. He was still trying to twist the truth into a palatable lie. But the comments told a different story. For every partner rushing to defend him, 5 more voices called him out. "We were there," one wrote. "We saw him with her."
Others reminded viewers of the necklace, the birthday humiliation, the restaurant scene. Context: it turned out wasn't on his side anymore. That afternoon, I met with Diane. I slid a flash drive across her desk filled with screenshots, receipts, and photos of Drew and Kayla at a lake house he had rented under another name. Diane studied the files slowly, her lips pressing into a thin smile. "This isn't just infidelity," she said firmly. "This is financial misconduct. Once this gets out, his reputation won't recover." I sat taller, hearing in her words the validation I had longed for. It wasn't paranoia, it was proof. We decided to release the evidence slowly, not in one crushing wave, but in steady drops that would keep him off balance. The first leak was a string of texts between Drew and Kayla mocking me as boring and bragging that Grandma's money keeps us comfortable. Within hours, the messages were everywhere. The second leak came days later, a hotel receipt billed to his company account on a night he swore he was away on business. The third was the photograph, the necklace glinting at Kayla's throat while Drew kissed her by the water. That image broke whatever defense he thought he had left. The internet was merciless. A hashtag began to trend mocking him, pairing his name with words like thief and parasite. Memes spread across Facebook groups painting him as a man feeding off his wife's inheritance. Kayla tried to withstand it, posting a picture with a caption about love conquering all. But it backfired instantly. Love, one comment read, "You wore his wife's necklace. You're not a victim, you're a thief's accomplice." Within 48 hours, her account vanished. Through it all, I stayed silent. I didn't need to post or explain. My absence only made his protests sound weaker. He went on local radio to claim the evidence was manipulated, but the host interrupted him mid-sentence. "The receipts show your name, Mr. Whitaker. The dates match. How do you explain that?" His stammer filled the airwaves, and within hours, the clip went viral too. By the weekend, even his phone number had leaked, forcing him to shut it down. Meanwhile, Grace and I lived quietly, ordering takeout, painting her nails in the living room, and letting laughter fill the spaces Drew had once claimed. My parents visited often, bringing groceries, their presence like pillars holding me upright. Naomi stopped by after work with takeout containers and stories that reminded me life outside this storm still existed. Each visit reminded me that betrayal might have hollowed me out, but support was filling me back in. Drew's collapse only deepened. Clients pulled out of deals, partners announced reviews of company finances, and whispers of legal trouble followed him. He paced in front of my house one evening, shouting about how I was ruining him, but I didn't open the door. Grace stood beside me at the window, her small hand finding mine. "You're stronger than him," she whispered, and I believed her. The final blow didn't come from me. It came from his own brother, who posted a single line on social media. "You don't steal from family and expect to survive it." The message was shared hundreds of times, a public disowning that Drew couldn't recover from. I read it late at night, the glow of my phone casting shadows across the room, and felt something inside me settle. I hadn't needed to raise my voice. The truth had carried itself. For the first time in years, I slept through the night. The house was quiet, Grace was safe, and I woke with the certainty that the worst was behind me. But I knew the storm wasn't finished. There was still the courtroom, still the matter of custody, still the financial knots to untangle. Drew's empire had collapsed, but the real fight, the legal one, was waiting just ahead. The courthouse was crowded the morning of our first hearing, a low hum of voices echoing off the polished floors. I walked beside Diane, her calm presence grounding me as we passed through the metal detector and into the main hall. I had chosen a navy dress that was simple and strong, one that made me feel steady without needing to be loud. My grandmother's necklace stayed locked away at home. I didn't need it to remind me of my strength anymore. Drew stood across the room with his attorney, his suit hanging looser than I remembered, his skin pale, his eyes darting to me before quickly sliding away. Inside the courtroom, the air carried the weight of expectation. The gallery wasn't just filled with family and colleagues, but curious strangers who had followed the story online. The name Whitaker had once meant success in Des Moines, but now it drew whispers of scandal. Judge Harold Stein entered his robe sweeping as he settled behind the bench, his expression unreadable. "We are here to address custody assets and financial concerns in the matter of Carter versus Whitaker," he said, his voice steady. Diane wasted no time. She presented bank records, hotel receipts, screenshots of Drew's emails, each one projected on a large screen for everyone to see. The silence in the room deepened with every page turned. "Your Honor," Diane said firmly, "this is not simply a matter of infidelity. This is misrepresentation theft and the deliberate misuse of marital and company funds. My client trusted her husband with her inheritance, and he funneled it into a relationship outside their marriage." She clicked to the next slide, showing a jewelry receipt billed to Drew's company account. The delivery address was Kayla's apartment. Drew's attorney rose his words stumbling as he objected to the context, claiming the purchases were business-related. The judge raised his hand. "The context appears clear, counselor. Sit down." Chuckles rippled quietly through the gallery before falling back into silence. Drew's face burned crimson. His jaw clenched, his hands gripping the table as though it could keep him from unraveling further. When the discussion turned to custody, Diane called on testimonies she had gathered, teachers who described me as present at every conference, neighbors who spoke of me walking Grace to school, and even her soccer coach who praised my consistency. The courtroom grew quiet as I took the stand. My voice trembled at first, but I steadied it with each sentence. "Your Honor, my daughter needs stability. She needs a parent who puts her first every day. I've done that since the day she was born. Drew hasn't." Drew finally snapped, slamming his palm on the table. "That's not true. I love my daughter." His voice echoed raw and desperate. Judge Stein's gavel came down sharply. "Mr. Whitaker, you will sit down and remain quiet until spoken to." The silence that followed was heavier than his outburst. Even Drew's attorney placed a hand on his arm, urging him to stay seated. By the end of the hearing, the judge's ruling was clear. I was granted primary custody with Drew, limited to supervised visitation. His finances were placed under review, assets frozen until a forensic accountant untangled the mix of personal and company spending. Every heirloom and property purchased with my inheritance was ordered returned to me. When the gavel struck to close the session, relief washed over me so strongly I had to steady myself on the table. Walking out of that courtroom, I didn't just feel victorious, I felt restored. For years, I had lived in the shadow of his decisions, but now the law itself had recognized what he had stolen and returned it. The crowd parted as I stepped into the hall, whispers following me, but this time they carried respect instead of pity. The fallout came quickly. The very next day, Drew's father, once his most vocal supporter, released a notarized letter to the public. In it, he announced that Drew was removed as a beneficiary of the family trust. "Our name carries weight," the letter read, and Andrew has dragged it through the mud. The letter spread across local business circles, a final nail in the coffin of Drew's reputation. Not long after his business partners convened an emergency meeting. Within 24 hours, they voted to remove him from the board of the company he had once called his empire. Their statement was brief but brutal. "We cannot conduct business with a man whose personal actions have compromised professional integrity." The translation was clear. He had become poison, and they would not sink with him. Meanwhile, Kayla floundered in the wreckage. She posted cryptic quotes online about loyalty and storms, her words dripping with desperation. But then, private messages leaked, showing her demanding that Drew buy her an apartment, threatening to leave if he didn't. The internet tore her apart, calling her a gold digger who had bet on the wrong man. Within days, her accounts disappeared. She had abandoned him the same way he had abandoned me, suddenly, selfishly leaving him exposed and alone. In the weeks that followed, Drew became a shadow of himself. Former friends avoided him in public. His gym revoked his membership after a video circulated of him lashing out at a trainer who joked, "Careful, don't put that on your wife's card." Even his phone calls went unanswered. He drifted from one borrowed couch to another, begging for money, begging for relevance, but no one wanted to be associated with him anymore. Through it all, I held steady. Grace and I filled our home with laughter again. Naomi came by with groceries my parents visited often, and evenings were spent in a kitchen that finally felt light again. I had walked through fire, but instead of being burned, I was stronger, steadier, more certain of who I was and what I deserved. And yet, even with Drew's world collapsing around him, there was one more step I needed to take. It wasn't enough to win in court or watch his empire fall apart. I needed him to see me face to face, stripped of the illusions he had once controlled, so that the final words would belong to me. The cafe was quiet that afternoon, a steady rain tapping against the windows, washing the streets into a dull blur of gray. Diane had insisted we meet in a neutral place, a public setting where words could not escalate beyond reason. I arrived first, sliding into a booth near the back, my coat draped beside me, and waited. My hands curled around the warm cup in front of me, not for the taste, but for the grounding it gave me. When Drew walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. His once tailored suit was wrinkled, the tie missing altogether. His hair lay flat against his forehead, and the lines around his mouth had deepened, making him look older than his years. He paused when he saw me, then crossed the room with hesitant steps, shoulders hunched. Sitting across from me, he stared at his hands for a long time before finally speaking. "Melissa," he said softly, "I've made mistakes. Everything's falling apart, and I can't do this without you." His voice cracked raw in a way I hadn't heard before. I studied him quietly, the man who had once walked through rooms with effortless confidence, now reduced to pleading across a chipped cafe table. "You were always the strong one," he continued, his eyes red. "Please, just give me another chance." He reached across, but I pulled my hand back before his fingers could brush mine. For years, I had begged him for honesty, for respect, for something as simple as truth. Now he was the one begging, and the irony was not lost on me. "You want another chance?" My voice was steady, calm, unhurried. "Tell me, Drew, what exactly would I be giving another chance to? The lies, the betrayal, watching you spend my grandmother's money to entertain a woman half my age." His face twisted, his jaw tight, but he didn't answer. I leaned in, my tone sharpening. "You didn't just cheat on me. You mocked me. You flaunted her in front of everyone we knew. And when I finally fought back, you crumbled." His eyes glistened, his voice lowering to a whisper. "I've lost everything. My business, my family, even Kayla's gone. I don't have anyone left." He tried again to reach across the table, but I drew back, folding my hands in my lap. The desperation clung to him heavier than cologne ever had. "I can change," he pleaded. "We can rebuild. People forgive. They'll believe in us again if we show them." I laughed softly, not with joy, but with certainty. "People don't forgive what you did, Drew. And I don't either. You keep talking about rebuilding, but there's nothing left to build with. You burned it all down yourself." His mouth opened, then closed again, but no sound came. The rain outside grew heavier, punctuating the silence between us. Leaning forward, I locked eyes with him, giving him no place to turn. "You're the architect of your own destruction." The words hung in the air, sinking into him deeper than any court ruling ever could. His face drained of color, his shoulders sagging, as though the weight he had tried to shift onto me had finally settled back where it belonged. I stood, sliding my coat over my arm. He didn't rise. He didn't follow. For the first time, there was no performance, no attempt at charm, no excuses waiting on his lips. He simply sat there, broken, staring at the ruins of the life he had built with his own hands. As I walked out, the sound of my heels against the tile echoed like a verdict. I didn't look back. The rain met me at the door, cool against my skin, and with each step I took away from that cafe, I felt lighter. The chapter that had bound me for so many years had finally closed. It has been a year since that rainy afternoon. Grace is thriving, stronger and sharper than ever. She speaks her mind with confidence, no longer hesitant to call things as they are. When I watch her on the soccer field steady and fearless, I see the cycle broken. She knows the difference between loyalty and weakness because she saw me find mine. As for me, I dusted off my degree and returned to the workforce. I carved out a place for myself at a marketing firm where my ideas carry weight, where my name stands on every account and every paycheck. I built my own savings, my own safety, and for the first time in years, I sleep knowing no one can take that from me. The house is brighter too. Laughter fills the kitchen, friends visit often, and every corner feels alive again. Drew, I hear, is renting a small apartment on the edge of town. He scrambles with odd jobs, tries to convince anyone who will listen that he's been wronged. But no one listens anymore. His name doesn't carry weight, his stories don't land. He has become irrelevant, and that is worse for him than poverty. Sometimes I open the small box where the necklace now rests. Not because I need its shine, but because it reminds me of something important. Betrayal had been the door I never wanted to walk through, but on the other side was freedom. Revenge wasn't about destroying him. It was about reclaiming myself. The day I walked out of that cafe, rain cooling my cheeks and freedom in my chest, I thought the story had finally ended. Yet endings have a way of unfolding slowly like a flower opening one petal at a time. Justice had been served in court, the truth had carved its way through gossip and headlines, and Drew's empire was nothing but rubble. But closure wasn't about watching him fall. It was about finding myself again after years of silence. Grace became the mirror of that change. She carried herself taller, spoke her mind without hesitation, and stopped apologizing for taking up space. On the soccer field, she ran with a confidence that reminded me of my grandmother's steady hands fastening the necklace years ago. She had watched me break and then rebuild, and in that she learned resilience doesn't come from pretending everything is fine. It comes from standing up when the world expects you to stay down. My parents, too, found healing in the shift. My mother's tears turned to quiet pride each time she came over for dinner and saw the light back in our home. My father no longer carried the weight of unspoken disapproval. Instead, he lingered at the table laughing with Grace, reminding me that family is strongest when it stands together. Naomi remained my anchor, her steady friendship a reminder that truth is easier to bear when shared with someone who refuses to let you falter. I poured myself into work, stepping into a marketing firm that valued my ideas. At first, I was nervous. Years out of the workforce had made me wonder if I still belonged. But each project reminded me of the skills I had tucked away while raising Grace, the instincts I had sharpened, managing a household, while Drew shook hands at golf courses. Now those skills were mine again, not buried under someone else's ambitions. For the first time, I had accounts in my name savings untouched by anyone else, and a voice that carried weight in every meeting. At night, when the house grew still, I sometimes opened the small box that held my grandmother's necklace. I didn't wear it anymore. It wasn't about its beauty or its value. It was about what it had come to symbolize. Betrayal had turned it into a weapon once, but now it was a reminder of what I had reclaimed.
The stone caught the light as I held it steady and unyielding, a reflection of the strength I had found inside myself. As for Drew, his name faded from conversation. Once spoken with admiration in business circles, it became little more than a whisper in grocery store aisles. I heard he rented a small apartment outside the city, taking on odd jobs to keep the lights on. Some said he tried to tell his side of the story, insisting he had been wronged, but no one listened. Relevance had been the currency he valued most, and now it was gone. That more than money was the punishment he could never escape. What I carried forward wasn't anger. Anger burns too hot to last. What remained was clarity, the knowledge that loyalty is not the same as silence, and dignity is not something another person can grant or take away. For years, I believed keeping peace meant burying my pain, but peace built on denial is only a fragile shell. True peace comes when you stand in your truth, even if it shakes the ground beneath you. Looking back, I don't see only betrayal and loss. I see the quiet strength of a woman who learned she could start again. The laughter of a daughter who knew her mother chose honesty over illusion. The steadiness of friends and family who refused to let me fall alone. I see a life rebuilt from ashes, not perfect, but entirely mine. Before we close, I'd love to know, when you think about Melissa's story, which part speaks most to you? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if these stories bring you comfort, stay with us for more journeys of truth and resilience.